Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very important webinar. We would just like to thank you for your attendance. My name is Megan Spires. I represent ICLEI Africa, and we're very proud as a network organization been serving African cities since 1995 to partner with the Covenant of Mayors Sub-Saharan Africa in hosting this webinar today. In particular, we just want to emphasize how important this topic of climate change adaptation finance is, particularly on the African continent. And this has been represented by us receiving over 440 registrations for this particular webinar. And of course, the panelists that we've been able to attract being so high level. So again, we want to thank you for everyone's time. We know how busy we all are during this COVID-19 pandemic. I just wanted to highlight that this is part of a webinar series that ICLEI Africa is hosting in partnership with the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa. And so important for everyone's scheduling. It will be held on the last Tuesday of every month at 2 p.m. Central African time and on different topics every month. I also just wanted to say that this really has been an important partnership for us as a network organization focused on sustainability, and the Covenant of Mayors Sub-Saharan Africa focused on climate change journeys with cities in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we really are excited to take this partnership forward, and also want to thank the European Commission for their funding of the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa. It is also important for us to say why this webinar topic has come forward. This webinar topic is so vital, firstly, because climate change adaptation is a major priority on the African continent and historically has perhaps not received the attention that it needs. And secondly, climate finance needs to flow to African cities and has not flowed enough, particularly to the local level where climate change impacts are most felt. So it's really an overlay of things that climate change adaptation is central and essential in Africa 1, and that climate finance needs to flow to African cities and hasn't done so to the extent it needs to. And so we're hoping to unpack these issues in this particular webinar, hearing from two honourable mayors and then also from two technical experts to shed some light on this very, very important topic. On that note, to introduce our speakers, which I will now do, we are very honoured to have Mayor Manuel de Araujo join us this afternoon. He, many of us know as the Mayor of Quelimane City in Mozambique. He's also within the leadership structures of ICLEI, both on the continent as part of the ICLEI Africa Regional Committee and globally as part of ICLEI's Global Executive Committee. And he's also the Deputy Chair of the National Council of the Mozambican Mayors Association. So we are very honored to have you, Mayor Araujo. We also have the Honorable Mayor Mohamed Sefiani, who is joining us, and he's also with us live, which is wonderful, and will answer a question at the end of the inputs. He's the Mayor of Chefchaouen Municipality in Morocco, also in the leadership structures of ICLEI, ICLEI Africa Regional Committee, President of the Moroccan Association of Eco-Cities, as well as the Global Covenant of Mayors board member. So very welcome to you, Mayor Sefiani. And then our two technical experts who have got years and years, in fact, decades of experience in the climate finance space. Carla Roosboom joins us. She's the Director of GFA Climate and Infrastructure based out of Cape Town, and has over 17 years infrastructure advisory, infrastructure due diligence, and financial analysis experience in South Africa and Europe. And she's going to reflect on some of her experience and how to unlock climate finance at the municipal scale. And then we have David Jackson. David is the Director of the Local Development Finance Practice at the UN Capital Development Fund, otherwise known as UNCDF, and he's a co-chair of the Local Board. And we felt in particular David's expertise would be useful considering the topic of this webinar, because he was one of the founding partners of the Local Climate Adaptive Living Facility, a very unique facility that the UN has founded to focus on unlocking finance, particularly for adaptation at the city scale. And David has over 30 years of experience to talk to, which is wonderful. So those are our speakers. And then just briefly to run the participants through how the webinar will operate, we'll receive the 4 inputs from our 4 panelists. During this time, we would welcome comments and questions, both in the questions and answers facility that Zoom allows for, which you'll see on your taskbar at the bottom of your screens. So please feel free to ask questions there. As said, we will pose 1 question to each speaker at the end of the webinar, but we'll be gathering all the questions that are posed throughout the webinar. We will post them on our webpage that I will share on the last slide of this presentation, and you're welcome to go and access your questions and see the responses to your questions over time. So we want people to feel rest assured that we will answer all the questions that are asked during the webinar, so please do so. We're then trying something new. In today's webinar, we will hold a short poll after the inputs from the different experts and mayors on our panel. That will be self-explanatory at that point. And then lastly, we'll also be sharing some resources for panelists and for attendees to be able to access additional resources after this webinar on this important topic of climate finance. And then the last point from me before I hand over to Mayor Arajo is to say that we have got a translation facility, which I hope many of you are already using. We have got translation from English to French and French to English, so please use that also at the bottom of your toolbar. All of the presentations today are in English, so if you're a French speaker, please take note of that and use that facility to hear simultaneous translation in French. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, and over to Mayor Arajo, the Mayor of Quelimane in Mozambique. Thank you.
Tell us a bit about how your city is working towards being more climate resilient. And please also share any particular projects that you are currently focusing on as well.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar at this very challenging time. As you know, both we are facing the climate change challenges, but also at this point of the year, I mean, we are also facing the COVID-19 challenges. So these 2 challenges are putting a lot of pressure on the few resources, both human and financial resource that we do have. Actually, the few resources that we had planned to use into climate change and environmental issue, now we are being obliged, actually forced, to divert them to face the COVID-19 crisis. But allow me also to start by saying that Quelimane City is, in the Mozambican terms, it's a medium, we call it a medium-term city with about 400,000 inhabitants. It's the capital of Zambezia province. The province itself has got about 6 million people. It's the 2nd biggest province in Mozambique. I mean biggest in terms of population, but also the 2nd biggest in terms of geographical area. Quelimane was built on the banks of the so-called Rio dos Bons Sinais. If you want to translate, it's called River of Good Signs, which is actually 20 kilometers, about 20 kilometers from the Indian Ocean. So somehow at the mouth of this river. Therefore, we suffer the challenges both from the sea rise, issues like erosion, like salt water intrusion, but also flooding. So flooding both from the sea, but also from the rainfall. So with these geographical conditions, of course, we face enormous challenges. Actually, Quelimane City is one of the most vulnerable cities, not only in Mozambique, but also in the African continent, not to mention of the world. And we frequently face flooding and other climate change impacts. So because of this geographical condition, we are very much aware of the challenges that we do face, and therefore we have been working hard. And actually, in the Mozambican context, even in Southern African context, we can say that Quelimane is one of the most active in terms of climate change challenges, plans, but also in terms of trying to build resilience, because we face on a daily basis the impact of these challenges. We have been working with different institutions, both national and international. Of course, as you know, ICLEI is one of them. We are very active with ICLEI, both at continental level, but also at the international level. But also we've been looking both for training, for capacity building, but also for implementing some of the projects that I'm going to mention here. First of all, we have been working for the last 10 to 12 years in the building of a drainage system, because as I mentioned, Quelimane used to have floods every year. So it was very important for us to find a solution for that. And one of the reasons being the heavy rain in this area. So what we did, we have been working with the Millennium Challenge account, which is a US-based fund, which puts at the disposal of this challenge about 36 million US dollars. This money was used basically to build about 26 kilometers of drainage. So this drainage managed to collect the rainfall water, the annual rainfall water, into the Bonj Sinai River. This was the first approach. But then we found out that we should change a bit that approach, because as I mentioned, this drainage was just collecting the water and pouring or directing all the gathered water into the river. At the beginning, it was a very fundamental step to us, because we stopped having the heavy floods annually. So this system managed to solve somehow, of course not 100%, but somehow the flooding from the rainfall challenge that we were facing. But now what we are thinking is to work on a different strategy, where we will create a man-made lake, so that the water is not just dumped into the river, but we can keep that water for other uses in different periods. Because collecting the water and throwing that water into a river, that doesn't solve the environmental problems, you know. So now we are working with the World Bank. We got a new project that started last year, which is going to help us build and redirect the new 28 to 30 kilometers of drainage, but also it will help us to deal with the challenges, the other challenge that we do face, the erosion, but also treatment of water coming from toilets and other issues. We also, in the last 5 years, we developed another project which we called, which was based on restoring the mangrove forest. Actually, mangroves are the first defense line against erosion in our city. So what we realized was that because people are quite poor here, they cut and they use the mangrove trees for their livelihood. They cut the trees to build their houses, but also they cut the trees for coal so that they sell that coal, but also they use for cooking, or that they use the trees just for cooking. So we developed this project, and we've been training the locals on the importance of ecosystems, of the mangrove, because actually 80%, if not more, of the people, of the poorest people in Quelimane city, they do their livelihood based on fishing. And we had to explain to them that if they continue cutting the mangroves, it will not only put in danger the resilience of the city, because if we cut the mangrove, then we will be very vulnerable to erosion, but also it puts in danger the ecosystem where actually most of the fishes do reproduce themselves, like shrimps and other. They actually leave the sea and come to the mangrove forest. That's where they reproduce themselves. So we have to explain to them the importance of the mangroves, but also we have been teaching them on how to replant the mangrove and how to recover, to help in the process of recovering the forest. To achieve that aim, we partnered, as I mentioned, to USAID, not only to USAID, but also to UN Habitat, because people were telling us, well, we understand the importance of the mangrove, but we are poor. How can we build our housing, our houses? What are the alternatives? So that's when we brought in World Vision and UN Habitat to come up and teach the locals about new techniques by using
I think we've had a technical difficulty there with the Honourable Mayor, which we'll resolve. Let me maybe then go to Carla while we're sorting that out. Carla, we've got a set of questions for you that we'd like to ask, and we'll bring back the Mayor after I've chatted to you. And the first was around the fact that we know African cities need more funding to support their climate change adaptation work. And what we wanted to ask you in terms of your experiences, what trends or shifts are you seeing at the global and or regional scale that can really make this happen?
Thanks, Megan. And thanks for this opportunity. It's exciting to see people from all over Africa participating, looking at the comments coming through. So what is quite exciting at the moment from my perspective is that we're seeing more and more programs being introduced that seek to unlock funding for climate-focused infrastructure at a local government level in Africa. And these programs include the Covenant of Mayors and Sub-Saharan African program that's now in its third phase, and that's also part of this engagement. Also talking about European Investment Bank's upcoming African Sustainable Cities Initiative. DFID is funding various cities infrastructure for growth programs across the continent. And then a new program that most of you probably won't be familiar with has just been launched in South Africa. It's called the Sustainable Infrastructure Development Financing Facility, which is targeting municipalities in the Western Cape province of South Africa, looking to unlock both adaptation and mitigation projects. So you'll notice from some of my responses that I'm not purely focusing on adaptation here, but we'll also be referencing some of the mitigation aspects of climate finance. So while it's exciting to see so many programs that recognize the need for action at a local government level and for developing capacity and financing mechanisms at a local government level, these programs do tend to have quite a strong focus on unlocking private sector funding through blended finance mechanisms. And whilst we understand the need for this approach, given that most countries are facing significant fiscal constraints and are not really able to provide the levels of grant funding through national fiscus to make the necessary investments in adaptation and mitigation infrastructure, this approach perhaps isn't always that appropriate to adaptation projects. And the reason for this really is that whilst blended finance offers a lower cost solution because it mixes grants from, say, climate facilities, donors, and national governments with debt from DFIs or even commercial sources to get to more affordable funding solutions, adaptation projects still remain quite challenging to finance if they don't actually generate a new source of revenue that can be used to eventually repay the funders. So while it's heartening to see these programs, we also need to, I think, we need more adaptation focused solutions. And I think in the COVID environment, we're also seeing that the types of projects that will need to be funded over the next couple of years will look very different to when many of these programs were conceptualized. The Mayor Arajo mentioned earlier that they're under extreme pressure to shift away from the climate funding that they were planning to do and redirect those limited funds more towards COVID-related projects that I would imagine include healthcare and basic services. So in the COVID environment, there's also an opportunity, I think, to redesign some of these programs to meet the future needs, provided that's possible, given the frameworks and policies behind the programs. I think just in terms of concluding on that comment, there's a real need to make it easier for local governments to identify and to apply for adaptation funding from existing sources. And I think that's probably where the biggest opportunity lies at the moment, is to help municipalities access the right skills and resources to apply for funding from available resources.
Thanks, Carla, and it's really great that you brought in the COVID dimension, because I think it has almost created a very new normal, and there's a lot of talk now about building back better and doing so in such a way that is also responsive to climate change, as well as dealing with health pandemics in a better way in the future. So that is an important line to draw in the sand. And also, just as you were concluding your comments there, you were speaking about what cities need to be able to better access finance. And that's really what the second question is about. It's about, from your experience, how can cities better position themselves to attract more financing for their climate change work, and in particular that related to adaptation?
My sense is that cities that have been successful in accessing quite a bit of funding, like the city of Cape Town, has made an investment themselves in the right people and passionate people who can drive the process. So I think if a city has the ability to put some money towards putting the right team in place, or at least a very passionate project owner, by hiring or promoting the right person in that role, and ideally a slightly bigger team, I think it demonstrates a lot of it shows that you've got skin in the game as a local government to potential donors who can then help you build out those programs and give you the additional capacity to develop your programs and to access the funding that you ultimately need.
Thanks, Carla. I mean, in many ways, this is a meeting in the middle. We understand there is this gap around climate finance at the local scale, particularly related to adaptation. So there's obviously the part that cities need to play, but I think there's also an important part that funders and financiers need to play. I know in our engagements as ICLEI Africa with city officials being our main target audience, there's often a frustration with not being able, or the sense of not being able to know how to access climate finance and where to go and where resources are. And I know that's been quite an explicit focus of Covenant of Mayors Sub-Saharan Africa, which is wonderful. I know you've been very involved in that. But again, just from your experience, what more can be done from the funders and financiers' perspective to perhaps put out an olive branch or assist a little bit more cities to be able to understand how to access climate finance and make that process a bit easier for cities and local governments?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot that can be done to simplify processes. I mean, I've worked on a couple of adaptation GCF applications, which weren't done at a local government level, but at a national government level. And if you look at the level of effort that goes into developing a full funding application to the GCF, I think it just seems to exclude local governments. So I guess one solution would be to have a centre of excellence in Sub-Saharan Africa, which has the necessary skill sets. And I think ICLEI already brings a lot of those skills to the table. But a team of people that have the capacity to support cities in developing concepts and funding proposals, and also to help them navigate what is a very complex space and potentially to translate, and I don't necessarily mean just from English to Portuguese or English to French, but to translate into a language that's more digestible by local governments and what needs to be done, and to allow perhaps the development of simplified applications and processes. So I think there's a real need for an entity that can sit between the current funders and local governments to translate what needs to be done, and and that has the capacity to support the local governments then to implement and apply for funding.
Thank you, Carla. So useful. And also just to say to the attendees that we will be sharing resources that Carla and others have worked on at the end of the webinar, and then also via the ICLEI Africa COVID webpage. So please keep an eye out for that. Without further ado, then I'm going to hand over now to Mayor Sifiani to make his input. Thank you.
Your city, Sub-Saharan. How is it working to become more climate resilient? And in fact, can you share with us any specific projects that you're currently focusing on?
Thank you very much, Stephen, for this important question. Yes, in Sub-Saharan, we are working from many years ago in the climate aspects and the sustainable development. But in this period, critical period of COVID-19, yes, the resilience is very important for us. So we are preparing ourselves to launch many projects in many areas of the cities to be more resilient, more sustainable, and more climate friendly. So we are preparing now the recovery of the city, and this recovery will be green and sustainable and resilient.
For the projects that you mentioned, for these types of projects, obviously requiring financing, what are some of the barriers to the financing of these projects that you yourself have experienced?
Yes, we are preparing a project of infrastructure. So we have now one project. We have financiation, and we launched this project is for the generalization of wastewater, because now we have 80% of the city with the networks, but we need to complete 20%, and now we have from the national government one financial support for doing that, and the works are beginning now in all the country neighborhood. Another aspect is public lighting. Public lighting, we have all the studies, we have all the materials for looking for the financiation, and now we are preparing with many partners, national partners and international partners, to have the financial support of this project to change all our network of public lighting in a smart public lighting, and with the LED technology to have 100% of our public lighting in LED and smart. Is the second aspect. And we have a third aspect, economical aspect. So we are working in social and social economy, and with ecotourism. Ecotourism is very important for us to support the private sector, local private sector, and to work to have more healthy, more greener, and more sustainable ecotourism in the city. So we are working in this three areas now, but we are in general we have our climate action plan, and this climate action plan we are making what you think actualization, because some priorities now is changes in this period of COVID-19. So now we are seeing is differently, and we are organizing consultative meetings with the local actors and the local civil society and professionals and the private sector to make our action plan more resilient to what happens now. Sorry for my English, not is so good, but but I try to explain what we are doing now in the aspect of climate resilient and sustainable development.
Oh, thank you, Mayor. And really, your English is leagues better than my Arabic. So that is it's a wonderful and very ambitious vision.
Thank you.
So, you mentioned the international partners in your response. Your city, in fact, is a member of several international networks, including ICLEI and initiatives like COMSA. In fact, you yourself, Mayor, are in fact on the governance boards of both ICLEI Africa and the Global Covenant of Mayors. So how valuable have these networks and initiatives been in driving your climate change work forward? This is in particular in relation to accessing finance for climate change and climate change adaptation.
Yes, we say always that finance must be localized, and now we can do it only with the local government, only ourselves. So we have to work with networks, and network like ICLEI, for example, with the technical support is very important to work together to have the best to share the best practice and to share methods for preparing a good project, good climate project is very important for us, and together we can do the lobbying, for example, in ICLEI Africa, in, for example, Global Covenant of Mayors and other networks, to have more easier to access to finance, because until now not as easy to access directly to international finance, climate finance. So I think it is a momentum. It's a momentum now because this COVID showed to us that local governments can do more and more. And we have managed that aspect of this crisis with national governments. So together, yes, this different level of governance is very important, and local government and mayors, local elected people can do more and more, but not every city alone. We can do it together. And this COVID-19 showed that Africa need more than others, many parts of the world, to work together, to have the direct access, because the needs of infrastructure, of adaptation, of the needs of people is more than other parts of the world. So we don't have another choice. Is a momentum, is opportunity to go together, to work together, and I think the expertise of ICLEI and the expertise of GCOM and, for example, UCLG, but especially ICLEI have the technical aspects for preparing projects. I think is very important to work together.
Thank you for those powerful words, Mayor. Is there anything that you would like to share in closing?
Yes, I like this term, the momentum. This year we don't have the COP26. Glasgow is 1 year after, so the next year. So we have time to prepare us as local governments. So together is a momentum to act now together in Africa, in all around the world.
And thank you to Mayor Sifiani for those powerful words. He is with us here today, so you will also hear him live answering a question. I want to then bring David Jackson in. David, thanks so much for joining us, and we really appreciate particularly your experience in unlocking finance for climate change adaptation. And the first question is the same one that we posed to Carla. It's around, we know that African cities need more funding to flow to climate change adaptation work. And what trends and shifts are you seeing at the global regional scale to make this happen from your experience at UNCDF? Thanks, David.
Thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So thank you. So I think two trends I'd like to talk about. Firstly, with respect to the blended finance question, so there is the International Municipal Investment Fund that has now been created, and together with partners, United Nations Capital Development Fund and United Cities and Local Governments are working on the pipeline for this. And we hope that this will be one of those interfaces that was mentioned by Carla. But it's not only this funding alone, it's also a growing recognition in some of the financial institutions that there needs to be a sub-national component of climate finance. And we had a discussion even this week with the IFC, about this. As you may know, the IFC is the private sector, a lending part of the World Bank. But the argument that we're making is the private sector, it should be, can also be the non-sovereign lending part of the World Bank, so that the World Bank lends to governments, but we need to look at non-sovereign, which is kind of local governments as well as private sector. So one of the key issues here when it comes to local government blended finance is that any debt that is taken on by a local government, even if it's indirectly, is part of the liability of central government, and therefore limits the amount that central government can borrow. And that's why central governments are often reluctant to allow blended finance at the local government level. So we at the United Nations Capital Development Fund have now created this coalition for a global financial ecosystem that works for cities and local governments, and is looking for ways round this, so that there will be the opportunity for local governments to access capital markets domestically, ideally, without prejudice to the central government's borrowing requirements. And if we can create that, that framework, I think that will unlock a great deal of climate finance for local governments. Because the second part I want to talk about is why there is an imperative to do this. And that is because there is a growing recognition now that if you really want to hit climate adaptation targets, and that is important because we are, by the way, I'm sorry to be a bearer of bad news, but it's too late to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. The scientists agree that. So adaptation is key. And if countries want to adapt and become stronger and more resilient, they have to look at their local governments. That's where the land use planning, the water management, the buildings management, the construction standards, the road, all of the things that need to be done for adaptation are at the local government level. So there is this imperative. And then finally, I'd like to mention that public finance will also be critical. And the central governments will need to actually look at local governments as part of their adaptation pathway for their national adaptation plans. And global climate finance on the grant side will also need to flow to local governments. The local climate adaptive living facility currently has 15 members, 15 member states, 7 candidate countries, and everybody listening to this call is invited to join this facility, which will channel climate finance from the Green Climate Fund directly to local governments. So the local climate adaptive living facility provides an interface between the climate finance world and the local government world. Of course, climate finance is sovereign finance. This is one of the problems. Climate finance, who sits around the table are nation states. So to join the local climate adaptive living facility, you need your Ministry of Local Government or your Ministry of Finance to agree. But once you do join it, it is set up to provide the reporting that climate finance requires, and then the support to the cities that the cities require. So there are to conclude, there are architectural issues that need to be resolved. On the private finance side, we need to get over this contingent liability problem so that local governments can access capital markets, preferably domestically, also internationally, but domestically is preferable. And on the public finance side, we need a realization by entities like the Green Climate Fund and by ministries of finance that adaptation finance is effectively local government finance. And that gap needs to be bridged. And we're working with partners, ICLEI, United Cities and Local Governments, and others on this. I'm happy to answer questions more specifically, but I wanted to raise these 2 big architectural issues that need to be addressed if we are to move forwards, and which we will need to do, because our future on this planet really depends on living with 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, and we're not there yet. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I'd like to go slightly off scripture, but I know, of course, you can handle it, because you've raised really for us quite an important point around what we would call multi-level governance or vertical integration, the vital role that national government plays in working with local governments to unlock climate finance. So we speak a lot about, and that was the question I posed to Carlo, and the same one I was going to pose to you now, around what more cities can do to unlock finance at the local level. But I would like to ask you, and maybe you've got some good case examples in which multi-level governance and better working between national and local government has perhaps been key to the success of unlocking climate finance flows to the local level, with both government tiers playing their part in unlocking that finance.
Well, absolutely. Good examples and bad examples. So let me start with a good example. So the government of Ghana has agreed that the city of Kumasi, which is a growing city, it has 3 million people, that the city of Kumasi can take a small amount of debt on its own balance sheet that it will be able to repay. And the Ministry of Finance has agreed to guarantee that for a program which will develop a revenue. There'll be a revenue stream, and this will be key to climate adaptation in Kumasi. So basically the government of Ghana, the central government, understands that this key city, if it's going to basically construct the infrastructure to adapt to climate change, that is in the national interest. And so it has to think outside the box and allow this blended finance program to take place by even allowing the government to take a little bit of debt on its own balance sheet. Of course, so that is a very positive thing that the government of Ghana has done, recognizing that its own national adaptation plan can be driven by the city of Kumasi. Now, onto the negative side, I'm not going to mention any names, but we are working with a country where really the government, even though some of the cities, which again are quite large entities, are pleading with the central government to be allowed to pool some of their projects in an application to the Green Climate Fund, the central government is arguing that in fact the implementing entity has to be national ministries, cannot be the cities, even though the legislation in that very same country, it gives the cities the responsibility and the mandate for land use planning and for the things that need to be done. So even though the cities have the implementing mandate, the Ministry of Environment, which is typically a regulatory body, will be the one that gets this project finance, which will be grant finance. And that doesn't make sense because the Ministry of Environment is not an implementing entity. Who implements are the local governments. So we're really working to get them to see through this and to kind of open their eyes to the fact that it's actually in the national interest for the city to be implementing these programs. I'm not going to mention that country by name, but you can see it's a mindset shift that national governments need to see to set their cities free and see them as part of national development rather than being kind of, I don't know, jealous of them or defensive about them, which is holding the country back. So that's, as the United Nations, that's the conversation we have with central governments. Of course, with mayors, we're working with them on their own terms. But with central governments, you have to change the dialogue a little bit in order to get their ear. So I hope that answered your question, Megan.
Yes, thank you, David. That was really useful. And then the last question before we go to questions from our attendees was around what funders and financiers can do more to assist in unlocking finance at the local level. But I also wanted to just get your thoughts, David, of the role of innovation. And, you know, we're really speaking a lot here about decentralization. It's about making sure that we tailor solutions to the local context. So in a sense, decentralization of climate finance, better liaison between national and local governments, but also in the private sector, you know, what role can SMMEs and small businesses and innovative ideas on the African continent play in progressing us more towards a climate resilient future? So just some reflections from your perspective in terms of the role of the private sector, the role of funders and financiers, and then maybe if, you know, from your experience, you've seen some good examples in which SMMEs and small businesses have been taken along on this journey, and it hasn't only been the big players in the room to move us towards a more resilient future using climate finance.
No, well, thank you very much indeed. So firstly, I think on the role of the private sector, it's important to stress that getting the best out of the private sector requires a strong public sector. And people often forget that. You actually need a strong, empowered public sector to negotiate, to deal with, and to connect with the private sector. Otherwise, things can get out of hand and you can actually have private sector driving it on its own terms. And you actually need a strong dialogue to make that happen. Now, having said that, yes, there are areas in which there can be a lot of innovation. One of the areas that we're seeing coming forwards now is the whole issue of waste and plastics. So, I mean, the plastics crisis is a huge environmental crisis. And there are some very interesting ways in which the private sector at different levels, both at the small SME level and at the kind of more consolidated, plastics processing level, are able to create value chains that go from the waste pickers that are collecting the plastic to plants that can reprocess and recycle plastic into useful things. And there are some countries that are experimenting with that. In Cambodia, for example, the local governments are working with others on a whole kind of system, a kind of economic ecosystem to consume waste. And I think that is a really, that is an example of innovation. And I think what is innovative about that is not only the individual SME, it's that an ecosystem is being created. And that's what one needs if one's going to get the private sector really moving. It's not one company doing one thing. It's how you create a kind of positive feedback system in which the private sector sits and does its role and makes its money, but with a positive outcome. And so you need to have a way of measuring this positive outcome. And that's another area in which there has been quite a lot of progress. There are a number of indexes that are now being developed. There's one, and not so much in the case of climate, but it's called the Women's Economic Empowerment Index, that can actually measure progress in a particular way. And you can use that to measure the way that ecosystem works. And then that can then crowd in the funding to drive that ecosystem. So in conclusion, I think the small and medium enterprises can really contribute to climate adaptation where this ecosystem is created. And it means more than one company. It means joining up value chains. Waste is one. There are other examples in West Africa on cassava production, which is a climate resilient crop, and how you can create, again, this ecosystem of different companies working together around climate resilient crops that involve smallholder farmers and then larger processors, which basically makes the whole agricultural sector a little bit more resilient. Now then, in terms of you asked the question about financiers, development finance, banks, etc. I mean, I think where there is some innovation coming in, I think, is an increasing willingness to look at impact measurement as a key part of the financing position, the financing and the financing environment, and then to partner with domestic banks. Because I think one of the key problems is that it's not the Green Climate Fund that's going to solve these solve these problems, or the World Bank. You're going to need domestic banks to invest in this type of thing at a domestic level. And those domestic banks are going to need to take up these same measurement indicators and things like that, and impact measurement indicators. So there's been quite some innovation in some countries of that happening. You're seeing Standard Chartered Bank in one particular Africa country starting to look at some of these climate indicators as a way of investing. And finally, of course, all of this comes back down to local governments, because you really need to put local governments around the table as the conveners, as the actors, as the agents for this. This has to be a local government-led thing, not something that is led by central government. And that means local governments need to engage with chambers of commerce, and local governments need to be around the table and be driving this debate, using their convening power and the power of the public purse that they have in terms of public procurement, tendering, contracting, to shape these. And I think that's where ICLEI and UCLG and others come in. And since the first Resilient Cities Conference in 2010, I think ICLEI has come a long way. I remember being at that conference, and local governments are now around the table and are now shaping this debate. And this is critical. So to conclude the 3 points, I think on the private sector innovation, SME innovation, it's really about creating this little joined up ecosystem. That's critical. Critical that local governments are around the table shaping this. And on the Green Climate Fund, World Bank, others, it's critical that we look at domestic banks as the way out of this. It's not only going to be through Green Climate Fund financing. And of course, domestic banks don't have currency exchange risks problems either. So it's how to get that created. And there you need a strong public sector, a strong local government to engage with those. I'll stop there. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you so much, David. Some really important points raised. So now I'm going to pose a question from one of our attendees, firstly to the Honourable Mayor Arajo, that's just, Mayor Arajo, very welcome, good to see you. The question has come from Francisco Salto, and is asking around peri-urban markets or informal markets. And I think this is quite an important question, both in terms of dealing with health pandemic, like we are dealing with now, but also in terms of climate resilience. And so Mayor Arajo, Francisco is asking, you know, if you have got any experience or inputs to make into how the city of Kilimani is dealing with informal markets, informality really in general, where there are significant climate change vulnerabilities, where health pandemics really take hold, and where in many senses climate finance needs to flow. Over to you, Mayor Arajo. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, and thanks a lot to Francisco Soto. Francisco himself has got a long experience in dealing not only with the informal sector, but with all other financial and developmental issues in Mozambique. What I would say is that the informal sector is part and parcel of the larger community. I mean, it's unthinkable to have a planning process or even a developmental process without taking care or without including the private sector, I mean the informal sector, in not only in Kilimani but in the other in the other cities. The experience we have was with the Mangrove restoration project that we developed with the support of USAID in the last 5 years. What was happening, I mean, we need first of all to state, or as I said in my initial statement, that the mangroves are the first line of defense, erosion defense for Kilimani City, but also it plays an important role in providing the ecosystem where fish and other crustaceans do develop. Therefore, it plays a very important role in economic activities in my city, since a large number of people do their living based on fishing. Therefore, what we did, first of all, was to train them and involve them in the process, and educate them about the importance of the mangrove. So, because they were cutting the mangroves for their cooking, they were cutting it for building their housing. So there was no way that we would achieve the objectives of the process without involving the informal sector. So they were part and parcel of the process, where we involved them, we trained them, but also apart from the training process that we had, they were part and parcel in the process of planting the mangrove. So the issue of reforestation, they were at the key of all this process. The other example that I could share is to do with what do we call here, the taxis. I mean, because of lack of public transport, the informal sector organized themselves, and now in the city of Kilimani, the main public transport are cyclists. They do taxi by using bicycle. So, like, you know, somebody rides the bicycle, but they take somebody on the back, not only to transport people, to kind of people, but also to transport goods. So at the beginning, this phenomenon was seen as something disrupting the normal development of the city, because the number of accidents were many in the city. So what we did was we contacted them, we worked with them, we advised them, and actually we even supported them legally for them to come up with an association, where then we created a school to train them about the rules, how to drive, how to follow the driving rules in the city, how to behave in the city. But also we came up with traffic lights and other techniques to, first of all, to train them, but also to bring down the number of accidents. Then they became empowered, because before the municipal police were looking at them as outcasts, as second-class citizens. But by engaging them, we included them in the planning process, but also in the development process. Actually, today, they play a major role, for example, by paying taxes, So like, we brought them into the planning and the development model instead. I mean, we included them in the process instead of leaving them or looking at them as second-class citizens. So these are like two examples where like people that were formally excluded from the planning and development process, where actually we promoted public policies that brought them into the mainstream, making them first-class citizens, but also ended up having them contributing to the incomes of the city.
Thank you so much, Mayor Raja. I think you raised so many important points, but one of which that really struck me is around equality. And I think like never before, the inequalities of the world have become so prevalent and visible to see through this COVID crisis. So it's wonderful to hear that at the City of Kilimali, you and your team, they are taking the issue of inequality so seriously and ensuring that those that are most vulnerable and those that are poor are dealt with almost with the greatest priority. So thank you so much, Mayor Raja, for those inputs. Mayor Sefiani, I'm going to come to you now. So we have a question for you from an old colleague of mine, in fact, Sean O'Donoghue from eThekwini Municipality, or Durban, on the east coast of South Africa. And he's asking, how can national local government associations bring their strengths to the table in terms of collective action across cities in a country?
Thank you very much. Can I switch to French? Is possible? Yes. Ok, je vais parler en français. Comme ça va être un peu plus facile pour moi.
So I'll speak French if you don't mind,
je salue,
because it's easier for me. First,
amis,
I would like to
je vois ici,
say hello to all my friends.
Je crois que la question elle est pertinente.
And I think this is a very relevant question.
And everything I said et aussi dans plusieurs reprises,
in my video,
que tout d'abord, il y a l'appui du gouvernement national et aussi on cherche l'accès beaucoup plus facile aux finances locales et notamment finance locale. Mais nous devons nous préparer nous-mêmes. Nous préparer nous-mêmes, ça veut dire avoir un bon plan d'action, des bons projets et là, du point de vue technique et aussi de point de vue des projets qui sont bankable, ça veut dire déjà ils sont prêts à être prêts. Et là, je salue David Jackson qui est avec nous parce qu'il nous assiste aussi
and I would like to say thank you to David because he's been supporting us
dans le cadre de la préparation d'un projet sur l'éclairage public sur lequel j'ai fait,
especially in the framework of the project for public lighting, as I mentioned. And for African cities, including middle-sized cities, we don't have
élaborer des bons projets
people who are ready
et des bons
to draft the right projects
ça commence par nous déjà. Et je crois que
this is something that we need to work on.
nationales
I believe that national
et aussi
organizations,
des organisations
but also
internationales, ils ont un rôle à jouer dans ce sens-là.
have a crucial role to play
Ça veut dire
in
un
this
appui
regard.
technique,
They
une
need
assistance
to
technique
bring technical support. They need to coach us. They need to train us.
D'une idée de projet,
To start
un
from
projet
the idea
déjà
of a project
techniquement
to
bien
a
construit,
technically
et puis
sound
d'un
and airtight project.
document qui pourra être présenté aux institutions
We should also be
financières.
able to translate it into a document that can then be presented to financial institutions. And
Et je
there
crois
are
que la
clearly
majorité, on a vu en termes de résultats, et c'est la réalité,
missing in that chain.
pas très,
And we've seen
très
it.
bonne,
This is
mais
a
c'est la
reality.
réalité des villes marocaines, des villes africaines,
In Morocco, in a lot of African
on a
countries,
des idées,
this is the
des bonnes
reality of
idées,
things. We have good ideas,
mais on n'a
but
pas de bons
we
projets.
don't have the
Et
right
là, ce
projects, and the
passage-là
outcomes are not
de
there.
bonne idée, une idée qui est un peu
Going from
intéressante,
this
à un bon
interesting
projet pour
idea
le
to
présenter
having
et qu'il soit
a
financier,
sound and
je
efficient
crois que
project
nous devons
to
faire un
present
effort
it
en
to
termes de villes
financial
déjà,
institutions.
en
This
termes
is where we need to
d'associations
work. We need
nationales,
to make efforts
en
as cities,
termes aussi de
as
réseaux internationaux.
national
Et je crois
and
que
international
ICLEI et d'autres
networks
réseaux
and
peuvent donner
organizations.
beaucoup
And
de
I think
solutions
that
par
this is where
rapport à
ICLEI
ça,
can
beaucoup de
bring
réponses.
solutions.
Et autre chose, je crois que
Besides,
maintenant, le rôle des
I
associations
believe that
avec
the role of
l'après-pandémie doit
organizations
changer un
in
petit
the
peu ce rôle-là.
post-COVID
Pas seulement
context, I
on
think
fait de
their role has
lobbying,
to
oui,
change.
c'est bien, mais je crois que maintenant,
Because, of course,
les
they're
citoyens,
doing
ils attendent
lobbying.
des projets concrets
Okay,
sur
but citizens
concrets
want
qu'ils voient.
tangible
J'ai
and
parlé
concrete
d'assainissement liquide, on peut parler de la mobilité, on peut
water
parler
treatment,
de l'économie
mobility,
sociale solidaire,
social
bien
and
sûr, amie, de
solidarity,
climat, de la biodiversité,
economy,
etc. Mais les gens,
biodiversity,
ils ont
climate
besoin
action.
maintenant, pas
Need
dans 2 ans,
actions
3 ans, 4
now,
ans,
not
mais
in 2 years'
maintenant,
time, not in 3
ils nous
years' time
disent,
or 4
vous,
years'
monsieur
time.
le maire,
They're asking
oui,
me,
vous faites un
Mr.
travail
Mayor, yes,
intéressant
you're
en
doing
termes
an
de levier,
interesting
de positionnement
job
au niveau
in
international,
terms
mais
of your
nous, notre
positioning
quartier, il
at
attend.
international
On
level.
a
But
besoin
in my
de la
neighborhood,
voirie, on
we
a besoin
need
de
roads,
l'assainissement
we
liquide,
need
on a
water
besoin
treatment, we need
d'un traitement,
sanitation,
d'une
we need
économie circulaire, d'un traitement de
circular
déchets,
economy,
pas
we need
seulement une bonne collecte,
waste
on est en bonne
management.
collecte, et tout ça en termes de ville africaine. Et
And
les fonds,
this
ils
is
sont
something
là,
that
mais ils ne
we're
sont pas
seeing
très bien ouverts au
everywhere
niveau
in Africa. We are
pour les
working in this
villes.
regard in
On a
Africa.
vu les chiffres, vous avez cité un chiffre de
We have
4%, par
figures. You talked
exemple,
about,
au
I
niveau
think you
d'Afrique.
talked
Donc,
about
ce sont des chiffres qui sont
4%
vraiment
in
là. Et là, je crois
Africa.
que tout un challenge à faire.
I think there is a
Il y
big
a
challenge.
des appels à projets. Il faut qu'on soit prêt pour les
Call
présenter.
for projects,
Des
and we
appels à
need to be
projets, et
ready
pas tout seul, mais
to apply
avec
to these
d'autres villes, avec
projects, not alone, with other
l'assistance technique
cities, with
des
the technical
institutions
support
spécialisées.
from
Et aussi,
expert
le
organizations
fonds vert, par exemple, le
and the
fonds
Green
climat
Climate
vert.
Fund.
Je crois, nous, au Maroc, par exemple, je donne
In
un exemple,
Morocco, let me
aucune
give you an
ville,
example.
jusqu'à
There's not
présent,
a single city
même les
up
villes
until
qui
now,
sont très
even
dynamiques, qui sont des
the
ressources
most
humaines
dynamic
adaptées,
and resourceful
aucune ville, jusqu'à présent, n'a eu accès à ce fonds-là.
not
Et
a
ça, c'est
single
vraiment
city
dommage.
has had access
Et lorsque
to
je parle au
this Green
Maroc, je
Climate
parle de
Fund, which
plusieurs
is a
pays au
shame.
niveau de
And I'm
l'Afrique,
talking
de
about
plusieurs
Morocco, but
pays
I
au
think there
niveau
are other
du
countries in
sud
Africa, in the
mondial,
southern
au niveau du sud. Je crois que c'est un index. Demain,
part.
il y
I
aura par
think
exemple au niveau global Commonwealth Mayors, on travaille
that with the
avec le
global
gouvernement
covenants
allemand,
of
avec d'autres
mayors,
institutions pour le
they're
lancement de
working with
GAFAM, par exemple.
the
Le
German
GAFAM, il sera
government
lancé très
for the
bientôt.
launch of
Mais il faut qu'on soit prêt.
GAFAM, and it will
Et
be launched
plusieurs villes
soon.
n'ont
But we need to
même
be
pas un
ready.
plan
And
d'action d'énergie
there
durable et
are a
climat.
few
Ils n'ont
cities
même
that
pas
don't
un
even
plan
have a
d'action
plan.
climat.
They don't even have
Et
a
là, je crois
climate
que
action plan.
tout un travail doit être fait. Et la
So we
Convention
need to
des
get
maires, et
ready.
je salue
And the
la
Covenant
COMSA,
of Mayor, and I would like to
qui a
pay
fait
tribute
un
to them,
grand
by the way, because
travail
they've
avec
done
ICLEI,
an
avec
outstanding
l'ICG,
job
avec
with ICLEI, with
l'Union européenne, pour
the
appuyer
EU,
les villes
etc., in
à
order to
passer
support
de plusieurs
cities
étapes, établir
to really
l'inventaire des émissions de
make headway,
gaz à effet de serre, établir un
to
certain nombre de
reduce
documents
greenhouse
d'études. Mais
gases,
maintenant,
to help draft
on arrive à
certain
ça. Nous, au
documents.
niveau du nord
But
d'Afrique, par exemple, nous avons un
in
projet
the
important qui
northern part of
s'appelle
Africa, we have
Climamed. C'est pour
Knimamed,
aussi
an important project
appuyer les villes
to support
pour
cities
les conventions des maires et puis
and the covenants of
les
mayors,
appuyer pour avoir des projets
support
bankerables. Donc,
cities
ça veut dire
in order
des
to
bons
have
projets à présenter
good
aux
projects,
institutions financières.
airtight
Je crois que
projects to
là, nous
present
devons faire
to
et faire vite parce
financial
que les
institutions.
citoyens
I
ils
think we
attendent.
need to act quickly because citizens are expecting
Voilà ce
results.
que je voulais partager
This is
avec
what I wanted
vous
to share with
concernant
you
cette question-là.
in this regard.
Thank you so much, Mayor Sefiani. Really important points. I'll now come to Carla and then to David. I think in terms of your inputs, Carla and then David, perhaps you'd like to reflect a little bit on what our two mayors have said, particularly in their response to questions as one. And then I have seen a question around accessing finance for sanitation infrastructure. And I suppose the question here is around, are there better sectors perhaps within climate change adaptation that are easier to be able to access finance. So perhaps a reflection around that from Carla and or David. And then we did have some questions around, one from Satish from New Delhi, so wonderful to have Indian colleagues joining us, asking about crowdsourced funding, is this an option? And then another asking about the insurance sector and saying we haven't really reflected too much on the insurance sector's role in all of this. So those are three potential areas, Carla and David, for you to touch on. It's the same question really to both of you, so we'll go straight from Carla to David. Let's start with you, Carla. Thank you for your inputs.
Thank you so much for all the interesting insights. I feel like I'm learning a lot at my desk today. I think in terms of reflecting on the sectors that are most suitable to climate finance, so obviously, while certain, just looking at the waste spectrum, certain waste projects have much more of a CO2 emission reduction potential than other waste projects. So one would find that if you were to try and raise climate finance for a plastic packaging recycling project, it will be more difficult to do so than to try and raise climate finance for a composting project, for example, because a composting project actually has a significantly higher component of methane reduction that results from it. So sometimes, whilst one thinks once you're busy doing a climate project that will attract climate finance, it actually doesn't generate enough CO2 emission savings to unlock, say, a GCF scenario. I think Megan referred earlier to work that I've been very involved in the last year through CommerceSA and GIZ, working with Global Clearinghouse to develop financing roadmaps for local governments, which will be used as part of phase 3 of the CommerceSA program. And we really unpacked from a very practical point of view how local governments can implement climate actions and how and to what extent they're likely to be able to raise climate finance for those interventions. And what we tried to do was to really start with tangible examples of how this has been done in Sub-Saharan Africa to date, but also referencing other relevant countries, especially India, to see what has been done elsewhere. So these roadmaps that are going to be published in July, so next month, will hopefully give local government stakeholders and staff an opportunity to just get practical insights into how you unlock both climate financing and other more commercial financing for projects that have a climate impact. I mean, our findings from this quite extensive study was that something like wastewater treatment and reuse lends itself very nicely towards both PPPs and climate finance. Also, we felt that on the waste to energy side, that anaerobic digester type of projects, fairly small scale, things that are quite decentralized. So in other words, an AD plant at an informal market also lends itself very nicely. Some of the challenges we saw though with accessing climate finance is really how do you achieve enough scale to develop a GCF application, and that is sometimes quite a big challenge. And there one really needs to look towards pooling projects across a number of local governments, or at least in a big local government across a number of sites. But I think if once those manuals are published, I think it's really worth having a look at some of the insights that were gained from there. It does cover also some adaptation topics such as tree planting and disaster risk management, and it hopefully will just give some impetus to a lot of people in local governments who want to implement projects but they don't quite know where to start, and they need a roadmap to help them understand what are the steps along the way for implementation. Thank you.
Thanks, Carla. I'll hand over to David for some reflections on those questions. David?
Indeed, thank you so much. I'd like to build on what Carla has said, actually, as well as replying to the points you asked. Very quickly, I think, Carla, that was a great intervention. And just to build on that, endorse everything that Carla has said, and to add further information on top of that. So we work very closely with the Green Climate Fund Secretariat. We work with the Global Environment Facility, the Adaptation Fund, and some of these global funds. As I mentioned earlier, they're all sovereign to the extent that the Green Climate Fund only recognizes entities that have been accredited to it, and they are largely state entities, sovereign, or banks sometimes, or international NGOs. So we've created this bridge now that supports the accreditation of a sovereign entity that, in order for local governments to access that climate finance. And I think that's a way that we can work together. For example, in Cambodia, the equivalent of the Ministry of Local Government has now become accredited to the Green Climate Fund for local government projects. So that is the kind of pooling that Carla is referring to. A city currently cannot achieve direct access to the Green Climate Fund. They would have to go through an accredited entity. And we prefer to work with national accredited entities. Now, the good news is the Green Climate Fund itself has a policy of prioritizing nationally accredited entities. So they would prefer to finance a national ministry or a national bank rather than UNDP or World Bank. And that's the way it should be. They should focus on national entities. But still, those national entities belong to central government or private sector and not local government. And that is absurd if you think about it. The city of Dhaka in Bangladesh should be able to get itself accredited if you look at the climate challenges that it is facing. The city of Kiliman should be able to get itself accredited, but currently not. It would have to be through a national entity. So one of the ways around this is to pool, as Carla mentioned, and the local climate adaptive living facility is a route to do that. And we have close connections with the Green Climate Fund Secretariat, and that is working in many countries. So just building on what Carla said, and I think that is critical. Likewise, the global, the other various climate funds are also like that. There may be bilateral funds that can help. Now, on adaptation and the informal sector work that was talked about, and insurance, etc. So there's something called the Adaptation Benefits Mechanism. So this is being developed by the African Development Bank right now. It's mentioned in the annexes to the Paris Agreement. And the idea is that it will deal with the other problem that Carla was mentioning, which is about mitigation, adaptation. So mitigation is all about greenhouse gas emissions, and you need to be able to measurably reduce those emissions to qualify. That is important, but we will only really crack that with the USA and China and other big emitters doing something. The other angle is adaptation, and it's much harder to get private finance into adaptation because you don't have a metric like carbon emissions. But the adaptation benefits mechanism is designed to do that and to provide, if you like, a subsidy for investors and also for smallholders, for SMEs, for the informal sector, for little projects that can take to scale, adaptive activity. So that is now coming forwards, and we're developing a methodology funded by the African Development Bank for this, and that will enable guarantee schemes and other approaches to be able to, for example, guarantee any bank that wants to invest in adaptive sectors. Now, finally, when it comes to the comment that the Mayor of Kiliman was mentioning about the informal sector, not everything is private sector finance. There needs to be a recognition that the public sector has a major role, and particularly in adaptation, and that adaptation finance also needs to go to the public sector so that they can play their role in working with the stakeholders. And that is where the national adaptation plans come in. Every country has an NDC, nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, and that includes national adaptation plans. And it's up to that country to really try to include intergovernmental fiscal transfers, public money as part of the National Adaptation Plan for local governments. And that will be the way to create the space for cities like Kiliman to have money to do the kind of work that they want to do, the outreach work as well with the informal sector. So it's really important to include intergovernmental fiscal transfers and finance from central to local government as part of the country's national adaptation plan in reporting to the Paris Agreement. And then when you have a COP, the country will have to report on how it has done that. So it's important to get that into the architecture there. Finally, on insurance, that is a great question. And that brings up the question of risk reduction. So another way that adaptation can start to move is by calculating it not in terms of carbon emissions, but in terms of risk reduction. And already, for example, if you try to insure, if you try to build a house in certain parts of Florida and get it insured, nobody will insure you because they know that that'll be swept away in the next, in the next 2 or 3 decades. So whilst the central government might be deniers of climate change, the insurance industry is not denying climate change, and they're not going to insure something which is not safe. And there is interesting work taking place with the insurance industry and adaptation finance. And we were happy to connect people up with that work. And this is, will be, I think, the future of adaptation finance will be in reducing risk, and risk is measured by insurers. So where you have a developed insurance industry, you can move it in that way. But of course, where the insurance industry is not that well developed, then that won't work. But in countries and markets where the insurance industry is working, it can drive adaptation finance in very interesting ways. So I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you to David. Good that we're speaking about disaster risk reduction too, because I see we've got Red Cross, Red Crescent colleagues on the attendee list, so that's wonderful to see. What I want to do now is just bring to all attendees' attention this final slide, which highlights when our next webinar will be on the 28th of July at 2 p.m. Central African time, the focus being on gender. So please tune in for that. It should be a very enlightening discussion. And then also you'll see, I don't know if it's on your left or right, but the resources that will be available to attendees, all of which can be accessed via the webpage link at the bottom of the slide there, also now posted by Kirsty within the chat. So please jump onto that webpage, and the study also that Carla referred to will go on there as soon as possible. And if you do have any questions related to that, please use the email address on the slide. And of course, follow us via Twitter. So I really just want to once again thank our panelists and thank our attendees. And I would actually like to give the last word to our honorable mayors if they would like to make a final remark. I'm just looking at you now to see if you would like to. Mayor Raja, would you like to make a final remark? Mayor Sefiani? Perhaps just raise your hand if you are able to. I see Sefiani, Mayor Sefiani, you've unmuted yourself. So over to you, sir, and then we'll see if Mayor Raja would like to make a final remark. Thank you for attending. Over to you.
Yes, non, justement, quelques mots pour conclure ce que vous avez dit. Je vous remercie parce que moi j'ai suivi avec intérêt toutes les interventions, c'est vraiment très instructif. Et je pourrais dire finalement que nous devons profiter de ces temps-là parce que le monde l'après-COVID-19, donc c'est pas avant. Et je crois que tout le monde maintenant en Yvelines se prépare pour une relance, la relance économique, sociale, etc. Et je crois que dans le cadre de cette relance-là, ça doit être vert, ça doit être inclusif. Et là, bien sûr, nous aurons besoin de bonnes idées et nous aurons des finances. Et je crois que dans ce sens-là, on peut aller ensemble et pour avoir des projets qui feront partie de cette relance. Et la relance, c'est aujourd'hui, c'est demain, c'est pas après 3 ans et 4 ans.
And recovery will be today and tomorrow, not in 2 years' time, not in 3 years' time. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor. I think I couldn't have summed it up. Well, of course I couldn't have summed it up any better. I really want to say a special thank you to our panelists. I think it was a very rich and enlightening discussion. I certainly learned a huge amount during this particular webinar. The recording will be available also via that same web address that you see on the slide at the bottom. africa.iclei.org/COVID-19, and you can go and watch it on YouTube later. As said, we'll have all questions and answers and comments up on that webpage, and we'll make sure that all questions are answered, and we'll engage with our panelists around that. And thank you so much to the attendees. We had wide attendance from across Africa and also the world. In this particular webinar, we will write up an article on the main findings and put up a map so we can see who attended from across the world. And without further ado, then I will close the webinar and thank everybody for attending. Thank you and goodbye.